August 1945. After years of brutal island-hopping conflict across the vast and unforgiving Pacific, the war is finally blessedly over. For millions of American soldiers, it's a moment of pure, unadulterated elation. Victory. Liberation. And for the lucky ones, a ticket home. Newsreels from the time capture this explosion of joy. Smiling faces, ticker tape parades streaming down city avenues, and jubilant sailors kissing strangers in Times Square. It was sold to the world as the definitive end of a global nightmare, a clear line drawn between the darkness of war and the bright promise of peace. If you want to understand the hidden, complex stories that lie beneath the surface of history, stories that challenge everything we think we know, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for more deep dives into our complicated past. Abrupt cut to silence. The tone shifts dramatically to somber and serious. But for tens of thousands of women caught in the violent, chaotic collapse of the Japanese Empire, the end of the war wasn't a simple liberation. It wasn't a parade or a celebration. For many, it was the terrifying start of a new and uncertain chapter, one defined by fear, confusion, and further violence. Their stories were not captured in the triumphant newsreels. They were buried in classified military reports, whispered in traumatized silences, and ignored by a world desperate to move on. This is the story of what truly happened to the women and girls swept up in Japan's historic defeat, and the shocking, often contradictory moments that unfolded when they came face to face with their supposed liberators, the American soldiers. Section 1. The premise: a system of suffering. To understand the shocking events that transpired at the war's end, we must first journey back to its beginning, to a story deliberately hidden behind one of history's most chilling euphemisms: comfort women. The term, a translation of the Japanese ianfu, was a piece of bureaucratic jargon created by the Imperial Japanese Army. This gentle, almost soothing phrase was engineered to mask a brutal reality: the creation and operation of one of the largest and most organized systems of state-sponsored sexual slavery in modern history. From the early 1930s until the empire's collapse in 1945, the Japanese military established a network of so-called comfort stations across its vast conquered territories. These facilities, which stretched from China and Korea to the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, New Guinea, and beyond, were in reality military rape camps. While the exact numbers remain a subject of intense academic debate due to the destruction of records and the silence of victims, most historians estimate that anywhere from 20,000 to 200,000 women were forced into this horrific system. The overwhelming majority of these women were not Japanese. They were abducted from occupied territories, with a significant number coming from Korea and China, but also from the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, the Netherlands, and other regions under Japanese control. The methods of procurement were as varied as they were cruel. Many women and girls were lured from their impoverished villages with false promises of well-paying jobs in factories, hospitals, or restaurants. Recruiters would tell desperate families their daughters would be sewing uniforms or serving as nurses, offering a chance at survival during economically devastating times. Other women were simply kidnapped off the streets, dragged from their homes by soldiers during village raids. Once they were captive, their ordeal truly began. They were transported hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles from home and stripped of their identities. Their personal belongings were confiscated, and they were often forced to adopt Japanese names, a systematic erasure of their heritage and individuality. Inside the comfort stations, they were treated not as human beings, but as military supplies, categorized and managed with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The stated goals of the system were twofold. First, to prevent uncontrolled sexual assaults by Japanese soldiers on local populations in occupied territories, which often inflamed local resistance. And second, to curb the spread of venereal diseases among the troops. However, in practice, the system often exacerbated the very problems it claimed to solve. The presence of these stations did not stop rapes outside the camps, and the horrific conditions and sheer number of soldiers the women were forced to service led to widespread disease. This was the world these women were forced to inhabit, a meticulously organized, state-sanctioned universe of unending violence, degradation, and despair. But as the tide of the war turned and American forces began their relentless push across the Pacific, this brutal system started to fracture. The women trapped inside, who had known nothing but exploitation at the hands of one army, were about to come face to face with another. What happened next was anything but a simple story of rescue. Section 2. the world they knew, life in the comfort stations. To truly grasp the profound shock of what came next, one has to try and imagine the daily, unending reality of life inside a comfort station. Picture a young woman, perhaps just 16 or 17 years old, like Kim Hak-sun, who in 1941 was taken from her home after being adopted by a man who promised her a better life. Instead, she was abducted and taken to a comfort station in China, a place where her name, her past, and her humanity were systematically stripped away. Life within a comfort station was a relentless, regimented cycle of horror. The rules of use, posted at many stations, laid out the cold logistics of their exploitation, detailing prices, schedules, and hygiene protocols as if it were any other military facility. Women were forced to service dozens of soldiers a day from sunup to sundown. Survivor testimonies describe queues of soldiers waiting outside their small rooms or makeshift cubicles. Resistance, refusal, or any sign of defiance was met with savage beatings, torture, or even death. Many survivors bear the physical scars of this brutality to this day. They were prisoners in every sense of the word. Confined to the station or a small designated area, they were constantly watched by guards. Escape was nearly impossible. They were trapped in a foreign land, often unable to speak the local language, hundreds of miles from anyone who could help them. This state of constant, repetitive trauma became their new normal. It was a world where survival meant enduring the unendurable, where the sight of a soldier's uniform was an immediate and absolute symbol of pain and subjugation. And it was from this abyss of systematized cruelty that they would first witness the arrival of a new, unfamiliar army, the soldiers of the United States. Their world, built on a predictable and horrifying set of rules, was about to be turned completely upside down. Section 3, The Liberation, a Collision of Worlds. As Allied forces advanced through the Pacific Theater in places like Burma, the Philippines, and China, they began to stumble upon these comfort stations. For the vast majority of American GIs, the discovery was a horrifying and bewildering experience. They were prepared for combat, but not for uncovering a network of military-run brothels filled with captive women. The initial encounters were deeply shocking for everyone involved. For the women, the sight of heavily armed, foreign soldiers storming their encampment did not automatically signal freedom. Their first, instinctual reaction was often one of sheer terror. For years they had been subjected to relentless Japanese propaganda that depicted American soldiers as devils and inhuman monsters who would rape, torture, and murder them without hesitation. Japanese wartime media often portrayed Americans as demonic figures, reinforcing the idea that surrender or capture was a fate worse than death. Consequently, when the women saw American troops, many braced themselves for a new wave of brutality, believing their nightmare was simply changing hands. There are a few well-documented cases that give us a glimpse into these chaotic moments. In August 1944 in Myitkyina, Burma, U.S. forces captured 20 Korean women and their Japanese proprietor. The subsequent interrogation, detailed in the U.S. Office of War Information Report No. 49, provides a chillingly detached look at the system. The report notes the women were apathetic and terrified, but were eventually moved to a POW camp where they received medical care. Photographs taken by the U.S. Signal Corps show these Korean women, some visibly injured, being questioned by American soldiers. However, such organized processing was the exception, not the rule. For most comfort women, their experience was far from straightforward. As Japanese forces made their chaotic retreat, many women were either executed by their captors to eliminate witnesses or simply abandoned to fend for themselves in the war-torn landscape, left to die from starvation or get caught in the crossfire. And here we must confront an uncomfortable and painful truth. The end of a war is not the end of violence, especially sexual violence. The period immediately following combat is often a lawless, chaotic time where the lines between liberator and aggressor can blur. During the brutal Battle of Okinawa in 1945, there are numerous credible accounts of sexual assault committed by U.S. forces against local Okinawan women. Okinawan historian Oshiro Masayasu wrote that soon after U.S. Marines landed, all the women of a village fell into the hands of American soldiers. According to some historical analyses, these were not isolated incidents but a widespread problem during the campaign. For a woman who had just survived years of systemic sexual slavery under the Japanese, encountering a so-called liberator who saw her as just another spoil of war was the ultimate, soul-crushing betrayal. Her trauma wasn't erased, it was compounded and transferred. This harrowing reality stands in stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the recorded experiences of the few Japanese female prisoners of war, primarily nurses and civilian administrative staff captured by American forces. Steeped in the same propaganda that taught them Americans were monsters, these women fully expected torture and execution upon capture. Instead, they were often shocked to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, an international treaty Japan had signed but not ratified, and whose principles its own military widely ignored. Captured Japanese women were processed, given clean clothes, shelter, and crucially hot meals and proper medical attention. For these women, who had been subjected to the same privations and brutal discipline as male soldiers in the Imperial Army, this simple, humane treatment was a profound psychological revelation. Letters and diaries from this period describe their astonishment at being treated with a level of decency that had been absent in their own military culture. This simple adherence to the rules of war was, for them, a shocking moment that shattered their entire worldview. Section 4. The Aftermath and the Great Silence. For the women who managed to survive both the comfort stations and the chaos of liberation, the journey was far from over. The end of hostilities plunged the entire Asia-Pacific region into a logistical and humanitarian crisis. The challenge of repatriating millions of displaced people was immense, and the former comfort women were often at the bottom of the priority list. Many were left behind, abandoned in foreign lands thousands of miles from the homes they had been stolen from years earlier. But even for those who did find a way back, a greater barrier awaited them: shame. They were returning to deeply patriarchal and conservative societies where the purity of women was paramount. The immense trauma they had suffered was often viewed not as a crime committed against them, but as a stain upon their character and their family's honor. Unable to face the social ostracism and the cultural practice of blaming the victim, many women simply remained where they were, building new lives in foreign lands under new identities. Those who did make it home often suffered from lifelong physical ailments, including infertility, chronic pain, and sexually transmitted diseases, as well as severe psychological scars like post-traumatic stress disorder. They concealed their pasts in a profound silence, a secret they carried alone for decades. This silence wasn't just personal, it was political. In the massive geopolitical realignment of the post-war world, the story of the comfort women was an inconvenient and uncomfortable truth. The new, democratically elected Japanese government was desperate to move on from its wartime atrocities and rebuild its nation. Simultaneously, the Allied powers, led by the United States, were rapidly shifting their focus from punishing Japan to rebuilding it as a democratic bulwark against the rising tide of communism in Asia. The Cold War was beginning, and a stable, friendly Japan was strategically more valuable than a full reckoning with all of its past crimes. This strategic pivot had a direct impact on post-war justice. While some Japanese officers were prosecuted for individual acts of rape at various war crimes tribunals, the systematic, state-sponsored nature of the comfort women system was largely ignored at the main international military tribunal for the Far East, held in Tokyo. There is only one fleeting reference to forced prostitution in the tribunal's final judgment. The mountain of evidence gathered by American forces, including intelligence reports like WWII Report No. 49 and harrowing photographs, was quietly filed away in government archives. The voices of the survivors, who were the living proof of this crime against humanity, were effectively silenced by a world that had collectively decided to look away. For nearly half a century, one of the greatest atrocities of the war was all but erased from history. Conclusion: remembering the forgotten. The war never truly ended for these women. For decades, they lived with their shattered memories and broken bodies, their stories untold and their suffering unacknowledged. They were ghosts of a war everyone else wanted to forget. It wasn't until August 14, 1991, that a 67-year-old Korean survivor named Kim Hak-sun bravely stepped forward, breaking nearly 50 years of public silence. Her powerful and painful testimony, in which she declared, "I am the very evidence," ignited a fire. Encouraged by her courage, hundreds of other survivors from Korea, the Philippines, China, and beyond began to come forward, demanding recognition, a formal apology, and justice from the Japanese government. Their collective voices finally forced the world to confront this dark and long-buried chapter of history. The story of the comfort women and their encounters with Allied soldiers is not a simple narrative of heroes and villains, of good triumphing over evil. It is a deeply complex and unsettling story of shocking contrasts, of institutionalized brutality and unexpected kindness, of lives saved and lives further shattered. It reveals a fundamental truth about conflict. The end of a war is never a single, clean event. For the most vulnerable people caught in its gears, liberation is never guaranteed, and the line between savior and aggressor can sometimes disappear in the fog of war. Remembering their stories isn't about assigning blame decades after the fact. It is about honoring the truth of their experiences, however complicated. It is about acknowledging that in times of conflict, the bodies of women are too often treated as another battlefield. The silence surrounding these women was a second violation, a theft of their history on top of everything else they had lost. That silence has now been broken. Now it is our collective duty to listen, to remember, and to ensure that such history is never again forgotten or denied. If you believe these stories need to be told and that history in all its complexity and uncomfortable truths must be remembered, please like this video to help others find it. And for more hidden histories that challenge what we know about the past, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell. Your support helps keep these vital stories alive.